Estamos aquí para dar inicio al seminario del Departamento de Estudios Sociales. Muchas gracias a Oscar Contreras, a Jorge Carrillo por la cordial invitación a estar en esta sesión donde se presenta un tema por demás interesante. Yo quiero darle la más cordial bienvenida a Martin Kenney por estar acá con nosotros, estar acá en el Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Él trabaja en la Universidad de California en Davis. Nos viene a platicar sobre una temática por demás interesante. El título lo están viendo ustedes: What has been the impact of returning immigrants on ICT Entrepreneurship in the home countries, data and debate. Me parece que es un tema que poco hemos discutido aquí en el colegio, pero que sin embargo a nivel internacional y en la migración México-Estados Unidos se ha ido incrementando, yo diría, en los últimos 15, 20 años, pero que ahora es mucho más visible. Entonces queremos darle las gracias a Martín por estar aquí con nosotros, por venirnos a platicar. I just welcome Professor Kenney to be here, and thank you for come here to Tijuana and talk about this interesting topic.
Great.
And I don't know how many minutes is open? 45 minutes to present, that's okay?
Good. Sure.
Okay.
Great.
Please.
Thank you, Rodolfo and Jorge. Thank you, Rodolfo, Jorge, Oscar, all of you for coming. This is the second in this series of talks, and I really appreciate it. The last one was just absolutely great questions, and made me think a lot more about what I was speaking of. Today I'm going to talk about the impacts of returning immigrants, I'll just call them returnees, on ICT entrepreneurship in home countries, and some of the debates about that and some of the data. This has interested me for a very long time. In 1999, Nicola Lowe, who was my graduate student at the time, now a professor at University of North Carolina, and I did some work on the Mexican consumer electronics industry and compared it to the Taiwanese consumer electronics industry, which was just in the process of morphing into the Taiwanese personal computer industry. And at the time, I couldn't figure out why Taiwan could do it and nothing happened here in Mexico. And you can read the paper, it was in World Development, very long time ago. So I was interested in this, but hadn't done very much about it until about 8-9 years ago, when Anna Lee Saxenian started writing about the impact of returnees from Silicon Valley and from the United States on Taiwan. And that then sparked my interest in this sort of larger topic of the role of returnees. And so I'm going to focus not on Mexico, but sort of the three success stories, Taiwan, China, and India today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that that I've put together to kind of understand this. And unfortunately, I tricked Rodolfo and all of you by not putting a published paper in the readings. I sent it last night, so I apologize. I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to go to the things that Rodolfo actually read. I apologize, and it's not his fault. It's the absent-minded professor's fault. So, Taiwan, scholars have noticed the development in specific nations. As we look across the world, we talk about Brazil, etc., but most people look at Asia. They look at Taiwan, China, and India are sort of right now the cases where there's ICT entrepreneurship, ICT growth, and that's really become quite significant on a global scale. So, there's a whole literature on returnees. Now, I'm not going to talk about the transnationalism of Luis Guarnizo, who's in my department, or Michael Smith, because that transnationalism tends to be on the low end, right? So you go back and you might start a textile factory or something. I'm talking about the very highest end of the global skill, levels, right? So the people I'm talking about are the kinds that got a bachelor's degree in India, China, or Taiwan, and then came to the United States and went to Stanford and got a PhD, right? So I'm talking about this very narrow segment on the top, but it's a segment that a lot of people had a lot of interest in. Well, Anna Lee Saxenian wrote a book, The New Argonauts, where she said these returnees get skills in the United States and return to Taiwan, China, and India and create new industries. She did most of this through interviewing returnees and a survey of Indians, Chinese, and Taiwanese in Silicon Valley, right? Engineers, managers. So that was her methodology. In China, Chen, Zhao, and Xu, wrote papers on Zhengquanjun, which is the Silicon Valley of Beijing, where a lot of the high-tech firms have been created. And they found that it to be different than the Taiwanese case studies that were really what influenced Saxenian the most. Wang 2012 has found returnees' knowledge transfer successes are contingent upon organizational home country specific contexts, which is, I'll argue that, though he and I disagree. He has 4,108 returnees from the US to 81 nations. So he's just returnees. He collected them all on the internet, surveyed them all, and asked them a set of questions. And then I did, and this is the paper unfortunately I didn't send to you, a historical test of key firms formed in Taiwan, China, and India to see where did the entrepreneurs that started the firm come from. This is really, actually, it seems quite simple, not many firms, but it's very difficult because you have to look back in history into the 1980s and 1970s and identify entrepreneurs, which is really actually quite difficult. But okay, so what are the observations? The people I'm looking at come to U.S. universities with bachelor's degree, then join U.S. technical firms, or at least get an advanced degree in the United States. Then they move back and forth, the Guarnizo and Smith and all that literature on transnationalism. And then Saxenian, she calls it brain circulation. So the brain comes to the United States, gets a degree, maybe works, and then the brain returns and gets involved in entrepreneurial activity. So that's sort of her metaphor. So let's look a little bit at the data to see what can we find that the actual data tells us, rather than just a set of interviews. And I'll return to methodology at the end to make a few critical comments. Okay, so what happened? What do we know? Increased cross-national mobility, work and education abroad. This is growing. This is a global phenomenon, and it's growing. Increased multinational corporation, cross-national corporate activities, R&D in China, R&D in India, R&D in Taiwan. So you're seeing multinational firms increasingly operating across borders. And that was really my segue into this when I looked at the multinational firms that were operating in Taiwan and what they did in the local community versus the multinational firms operating in your maquiladoras and what they did locally. So this is my segue into this. Lower costs of travel, easing visa restrictions. Okay, people can move back and forth more easily. Pretty obvious, we all know that. So what were my findings? So I looked at Taiwan. And what I did is, it's awful hard to read, but I looked at the founders of the early Taiwanese ICT firms. Right now, there's a problem here. I have a censorship problem. I'm censoring only on the ones that are big and are here today. Very hard, and I couldn't find, let's say, firms that disappeared. So I'm going back to Honhai, which is Foxconn, right, of Apple computer fame. That was started by someone, no Silicon Valley experience, no U.S. work experience, no U.S. educational experience. Acer, you've probably heard of it. I think Acer's still relatively active. No U.S. experience, right? And I discuss this more in the paper. Then I go through, and what I do find is that in the early days, by the 1980s, you're starting to get returnees from the United States. And I have their degrees and where they worked and their Silicon Valley experience, et cetera. And so what you can see is from this particular case, set of firms, some confirmation of the Saxenian hypothesis, right? Not complete confirmation, but you'd have to say some confirmation. So what I did then is I looked at the next level, which is the early Taiwanese integrated circuit design firms, right? This is silicon. Now these firms come in a lot later, 87, 93, as if you look at the founding date. And there you see far more Taiwanese in Silicon Valley or U.S. influence of returnees, right? So, but this is later, and this is going to be part of my argument that really I think does apply to Mexico. So this is 87. This is much higher tech, right? This is semiconductor design. This is high tech. This is PhDs and master's degree in electrical engineering and computer science. These are high level. Foxconn, the earlier companies, are just putting together parts and selling computers, a very different entry level.
Why are so many unknowns? I mean,
Unknown.
It was a survey.
Just can't, no.
It was from the web. Or
This is from the web, and I asked Mei-Che Hu at National Taiwan University to actually try to find these people. And I just couldn't find them. Not on the web, nowhere. So we didn't actually do interviews. Most of this is web search, and then we asked someone in Taiwan to go through and try to find them. So some of them just can't be found where they are. They may be dead, right? And so they've kind of disappeared. So some we were able to verify with none. Others we were able to verify with real data, and then others just couldn't find them. After quite a bit of searching, you just weren't there. But what I'd like you to reflect on here is if we could pull the unknowns out, but then that would show that we were better researchers than we were. Better to put them in and just let it sit at that. But what you see, all I want you to see here is that there are more. Later in history, higher tech and more, which will bring me to my conclusion about Taiwan. Can returnees explain Taiwanese success? Okay. So, in the paper we discussed, there were MNC consumer electronics firms went to Taiwan in 1960. We showed that low in Kenney, and that created a base. Now, the MNC went there and hired locals. I mean, they may have parachuted in a couple from the United States, but they hired locals. Okay. The early local entrepreneurship that I showed, right, this, right in there.
You had to put in that here.
Oh, sorry. But I'm brain dead, sorry. Okay, this and all of this helped create an environment that then later could allow people to return with high skills. So if you tried to return with high skills in the earlier days, the absorptive capacity for the community, for the place, was not there, right? So what we're really talking about here is an absorptive capacity. Then the Taiwanese government got involved in trying to build semiconductor capability because they had an industry that was now ready to consume the semiconductors, right? So they could start low end in semiconductors, which is where you would start, but sell to the local industry. Over time, they became so capable that they then could sell into the global market. But this all has to be seen on a time series of developing local capabilities to absorb the knowledge and to absorb the returnees when they come back, to allow them to be successful in that environment. And then as we show, in semiconductors, the returnees become much more significant at that higher level, but they're able to return to an environment that's already been built. So I think Nicola Lowe and my observation many years ago is that in Mexico, we didn't see that. Now you might have seen it, we could have a discussion of that at the end, around Guadalajara, right? But I think it kind of dissipated before it could take off. And the Taiwanese government was, from the beginning, very interested in making local international connections. And this was a conscious policy that they were pushing constantly to create the absorptive capacity in the environment to build upon. And then, of course, as I showed, the IC design firms, that's sort of the sort of late 80s, had much stronger linkages. Right? So you can see Taiwan having this long period of gestation, government policy, I won't talk about it here because I don't have time, government policy very involved and very targeted to creating those connections and then encouraging the returnees to come back to an environment that actually could absorb the knowledge. Okay, so let's look at India. India's got it. So Professor Saxenian put them all together, and I argue they actually look quite different. So were returnees critical here? I will show in the next slide that many founders returned, but all of them, nearly all of them except for one case, returned directly from study abroad. Right? So they didn't go to work in the United States, they returned directly from study abroad. They went over, they got some knowledge, they went to MIT, and then they came back. The government early policies regarding IT liberalization were driven by internal pressures, and there was never really any real effort to connect the local environment to the IT, the returning IT entrepreneurs. So India had a laissez-faire. I mean, it happened for a set of reasons, much more laissez-faire. And it was the multinationals that made Bangalore the Silicon Valley of India. Rather than the Taiwanese case, it was much more Taiwanese local with the government and then the returnees dropping on top. It was really the multinationals that create Bangalore. So here's the founders of the early Indian IT services firms. These are the software firms, TCS, Infosys. They're all here now in Mexico. Wipro, they're all particularly in Monterrey. Well, what's interesting here? What's interesting here is none, right? None, a few. That's Wipro. There's a Zimprenji, 2 years at Stanford, and then went home when his father got sick, never finished his degree. Here's Putney Computers, one of them. But and here, all they did is got a degree, no work experience, and went directly home. But what you see here is that the Indian experience is, again, very, very different. Now, I won't go into greater detail. The paper goes into greater detail about this. The Indian returnee phenomenon is actually quite late. It's 1990, 1989, during the dot-com bubble. That's when returnees start going home, and the Indian environment has become strong enough to have an absorptive capacity. Prior to that, there was very little absorptive capacity for the high-level skills. And I've interviewed a number of Indians who went back sort of in the early 90s, and they said, I went there, I spent 6 months, I couldn't get anything done, so I returned. Versus in the 2000 period where you could go back, now there's an environment, right? It's a bubbling environment. There's capable people. They've been in multinationals, et cetera. Now as a returnee, you could go back and pull people together and create a firm that had a possibility of success. Let's see. So as I said down there, again, I'm summarizing the paper. It's online. I sent it to Oscar. If you're interested in reading it, you can get a great deal more detail on this. Now, I'll skip to what I think most people in the United States are most interested in, is China. China is obviously disrupting the global ICT industry right now. So a lot of people are very interested in China. So, in the 1980s, China starts to open up, and there's a set of reforms, right? Deng Xiaoping and the reforms, and immediately, right, there were a bunch, in particular, university spin-offs to build computers. These are in the Zhenghuanzhou area of Beijing, is really the center of this, to build computers and software for the Chinese market. There are no returnees involved. These are all indigenous Chinese. Now, it's not surprising there are no returnees, because it's only in the mid-1970s where anybody from China was coming to U.S. U.S. markets, U.S. universities, etc. So it's not surprising that this early days, no returnees at all. The mid-1980s, you get the telecom equipment corporations, firms are started, established, Huawei, ZTE, all the now real global leaders, no returnees among the founders, just no returnees. There aren't any returnees to get anyway, so.
One question. Returning is always related to the U.S. education or whatever abroad education?
So I checked all of these firms, and there were no others except U.S. education. So I would have put down if they had other educations, but in the firms I've looked at, it's the U.S. or it's not, right? It's either that or not. And, which is not completely surprising because we're talking about ICT here, right? In the United States, since World War II, has been so dominant in information and communication technologies outside of, let's say, some of the communication technologies in the telephone switching area, where every country had a national champion. Those are all now gone too, right? So, and most of the people that would have gone to, let's say, an AT&T or a firm like that, joined a big firm, they never returned. So yeah. So it's just the United States, because this is not a diaspora, as some people call it. It's actually basically a one-way flow to the United States in these sectors. I mean, outside Chinese restaurants, et cetera, that's a much more global flow, but we're not talking about the restaurant owner. Okay, so, oops, sorry about that. So, so all the early firms, I won't put the data up here, it's in the paper, you can read it, it's absolutely incontrovertible. There were no returnees involvement. The internet bubble firms are quite interesting, right? Because the internet bubble starts, let's say in 97, 98, 99. And in China, there's already an ecosystem of growing ICT industry. I think that P was supposed to be positive policies. Internet bubble firms. Also, the Chinese government had very positive policies towards internet entrepreneurship. They were trying to encourage it in China, right? Now, what I'll show is the returnees were present. There were returnees, but they're not dominant. I'll show some new data that we've done, which is what Rodolfo actually read, unfortunately. And all of these internet firms were for the internal market. So what happened at the internet bubble firms? Remember, we're talking how important are returnees? So you'd expect them over time, the Taiwanese model, as they became more important, right? So what I'm going to do is I collected all Chinese initial public stock offerings on the U.S. market. And the vast majority of these were in the internet or the ICT space. There were a few others, biotech, some other spaces, right? It's a time series. We can talk about at each point in time. At an IPO, what you can do is you can pull out the CEO, the CFO, the board of directors, all of the management team. And in each of them, they have their educational and their corporate background. Where did they work prior to coming to this firm that is now going to go public? So what we have is a set of snapshots of firms over time going public, right? And we're looking at the board of directors and the managers, CEO, CFO, etc. Now I'm going to truncate my presentation just to look at them, right? But these you would expect. They're going to go public in the U.S., so they're going to sell stock to U.S. investors. So you would expect returnees, a large number of returnees, because they're going to interact with the U.S. market. So you'd expect them to be highly concentrated here. We looked at all the top managers, members of the board of directors by function, and we identified their major career experiences for all of them. Right? This is all of the major Chinese software and internet firms from the internet generation. So this is a nice place to look at where the returnees are. So here I have the attributes of the managers and independent directors. This is all summed, right? at the time of the IPO. So that means the company went out in 1999, it sold its stock. I take that as a time. If the company sold its stock for the first time in 2000, that's the time. 2001, all the way through 2011, when our panel ended. And then I have a set of curves here. Now these curves are, we went through and we classified everyone. Did you have U.S. work experience or a U.S. education? These are significant levels. This is 0.001. This is extremely significant. It's the significance of the curves. Are they changing over time?
What is the N?
The N would, okay, so this N is about 1,500 people. CEO, board of directors, 1,500 individuals on 120 firms.
Okay.
So each firm has about 10 individuals. Okay? So we're just looking at the individuals here. And then they go, the individuals at each IPO. Okay, so 120 firms and 1,500 individuals.
So shouldn't you be looking at the firm instead of the individual?
So we can look at the firms.
And it's about the same or no? I guess my question has to do with, are those firms different from firms that didn't have returnees? Are they, yes they are.
So
Are they significantly different? That's what you're saying?
are they, so what, all I'm looking at here is the curve of the individuals. Now I'm only going to put a few curves up here. I'm not putting CEO. If I put CEO, there's one CEO per firm. And you can see, in the next slide, you'll kind of see this. What you can see is for the CEO, it's exactly the same pattern. So they're becoming less and less returnees. And I'm going to put entrepreneurs up next. But all I want you to look at here is the decrease in people with U.S. experience over time. So returnees become less important over time.
Okay.
Right? So returnees aren't becoming more important over time. They're becoming less so. So there are less and less, let's see, this is mainland education, mainland work experience. So this is going up. Obviously, are you a Chinese ethnicity? That's by name is going up. But the U.S. experience, that means, did you have U.S. experience, is going down. This is at a time where you might expect returnees, so there are more people returning during this whole period, right? Chinese are returning more and more. The market is hot. But what we're seeing in the firms themselves is less returnees. This is the attributes of the founder CEO, right? This is an N of about 85. So about 2/3 of the CEOs were also founders. I have just CEO data, but I just want to use founder CEO because that's where you might expect returnees to be the strongest. They're going back with all the skills they developed from the United States, and they're starting firms. And what we actually find is that it was very high in the beginning, right? It drops dramatically. So over time, returnee founders are dropping. Right, which is kind of, we're a little bit surprised because the literature would suggest, right, that you should have more founders over time, right, returnee founders. And these are very specific firms. These are firms that are listing in the U.S. market, right? These aren't Chinese firms staying in China. These are Chinese firms listing in the U.S. market, which is where we would expect the highest number of returnees. But over time, they're essentially disappearing, the returnees. And it was last week at UCSD, there was the founder of one of the first firms, Charles Zhang of Sohu. And he confirmed, I said, well, look at this data. He confirmed, yeah, returnees are no longer important. So what we'd expected is returnees as the environment grows to become more important, but in the case of China, in fact, they became less important. So, Chinese returnees, sort of the Saxenian story applied to China. unimportant during the 1980s, some importance during the internet bubble, actually pretty significant. This is the internet bubble, right? 1999-2000 is that internet bubble that collapses, but becoming less important over time, but increasingly less so later. So, what can we get out of this? In East and South Asia, Silicon Valley was clearly a vision for policymakers. I mean, you can read the literature. It was for sure a vision of how we're going to enter the ICT industry. Very, very important, we argue, is developing an ecosystem through indigenous entrepreneurship. The state may have a role, but indigenous entrepreneurship is necessary to create a platform upon which highly skilled returnees, with a lot of human capital, if you like that term, can come back and implant and do something, right? So if you take let me just give a silly example. If you take PhDs from Stanford, 20 PhDs in electrical engineering and computer science, and you parachute them into, a friend of mine just came back from San Cristobal in Chiapas. Will they be able to do anything? And the answer is probably no, because there's not an ecosystem there. If I was the government and I wanted to do this, I would have parachuted them in, and I don't know much about Guadalajara, but at that moment I would have parachuted them into Guadalajara, because there was some things going on, indigenous capabilities that you might be able to build on. And I know Oscar's been looking at entrepreneurship in Tijuana. Well, maybe this now would be the place that you might want to take these kinds of people and parachute them in, because you would have a set of skills that they could mobilize. You would have an environment, maybe a set of customers that could be mobilized. All of the kinds of things when we talk about clusters, we all go, yeah, sure, that's obvious. But in this literature, I don't think it was obvious, interestingly enough. Returnees were not the key to takeoff. They were not the key to takeoff. In each of these cases, they were not the key to takeoff. But as spice in a brew that's already bubbling, we absolutely would agree, and particularly in the Taiwanese case, that they had value, but also in the early case of the internet bubble in China, and then later in the late 90s and 2000 in India. Taiwan is the clearest case of where Saxenian's argument is the strongest. It's clearly the case. In the other two, it's much less strong. And in China, which is what everybody's interested in, and people have been writing about, they were clearly the least important, which is not what people would have expected. Other observations that are in the paper that I didn't dwell on is multinational corporation technology transfer role is underestimated in this literature. And there's a literature now in the sort of international business which really starts to look at tech transfer from multinationals to the local region. Now, this doesn't just happen automatically. State policies can be quite important in pushing that. But anyway, it's underestimated in the case of Taiwan, India, less so China. So what do we need? We need to understand exactly what compatriots abroad did deliver. I don't think we really understand what people abroad did deliver in the growth of these particular environments. Business linkages is very important, and there's a little bit of literature on that. A belief among the locals when they saw their best friend go to the United States and become very successful in Silicon Valley or somewhere, that they could do it here. It's a belief that you can undertake something. If you don't believe anything can happen, it's unlikely that anything will happen. So that's, I think, really important. Role models. And then, policy. Policy, particularly in the case of Taiwan and China, is very important. In the case of India, it was sort of backhanded policy, but it ended up being quite important. So, how to understand this discussion of returnees? Is it Western ethnocentrism? Asians naturally incapable of being entrepreneurs until westernized and returned home. I don't believe it's that. But you read this literature and you go, well, gee, they couldn't have done it in Taiwan except for the people who went to America and got fixed, and then they were reinserted. I'm being very sarcastic, I'm sorry. And I don't think that's what people were thinking. But is that the story here? Because Americans, United States American, North American, U.S. American, whatever. I don't want to get into that battle. Sometimes are very good at lecturing people on how good we are and how they should be more like us. Sorry, being sarcastic again. Sometimes my humor doesn't go over unless you know me. Is it methodology? So you interview returnees or people in Silicon Valley and ask them, how important were you for the success of your country? Oh, I was unimportant. That's not a usual answer, right? You ask, well, how important is Jorge for Colef? Oh, not very important. Yeah, so if he's unlikely to say whether, I know you're important, but he's unlikely to say, oh no, I wasn't important at all, I just came here. No, you get the leading question problem, right? So is it a methodology? So what we did rather than ask people is we went and looked at the firms to see if they were actually there, rather than asking someone, were you important, right? I mean, you ask me, how important am I to Davis? I'm very important, right? No, and you go up there and then nobody knows me. You see what I'm getting at here. Is it a justification for the brain drain? Right? Because clearly there's an argument here that all of these great engineers from around the world, India, China, Mexico, etc., being brought to the United States, there was this big brain drain argument many years ago. Is this flipping it on its head and saying, oh, this argument, and kind of a neoliberal argument, doesn't matter, move all the bright people out of these countries, move them to the United States, and it's good. Okay, I'm not, how do we understand this discussion in a sort of sociology of knowledge? Okay, so policy implications. Build indigenous entrepreneurship firms ecosystem. Developing absorptive capacity is critical. That means part of your universities. That means potentially sending people abroad, like many of these countries did, with kickers, such that somebody had to sign off saying all the money that is spent to send that person abroad, you will lose if they don't come back for 5 years. So they did all sorts of those tying so that they can make sure these bright people came back. Strong educational system, particularly in engineering, is very important. And in all of these countries, engineering and very good undergraduate engineering skills, very, very emphasized. The graduate education can be abroad. In many cases, that was conscious. Graduate education's abroad. The U.S. has the best schools. We'll send them there. We're talking about engineering, not across the board, but I think most people would agree with that. And then, can they come back, right? And then, of course, the larger is ICT is vitally important because, as Danny Roderick and Danny Bresnitz both have shown in a series of papers, there's so many pathways to improvement, to moving up the value chain, which is much harder in most other industries to move and pick off new pieces of the value chain and move up. So ICT is really important. Many, this is my perception, Latin American countries and Southeast Asian countries to some degree have not focused on ICT. They've sort of had this general policy. ICT has been, so far, the key industry. And with that, I will end. I maybe went too long. I apologize.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Martin. I will make few comments, but I will not make it this kind of from your perspective. Perhaps I will focus a different way this issue because my area is more related to migration, international migration. So because when I was reading these articles, Oscar Salmi, I was thinking from Mexico, U.S., and mainly from migration. In this case, the high-skill migration, Mexico, United States. I think this issue is really very helpful now in the debate of the Mexican discussion, not just migration, but also in this case of the different capacities of Mexico in terms of the high qualified labor markets, if it has some kind of the development or not. So what I mentioned first is perhaps Mexico has grown up in this high-skill migration, Mexico to United States. But at the same time that the migration, the Mexican to United States has declined, the high skill also has declined. But there's still, in the last decade, this migration has grown. It was around 300,000 people in 2000, the high qualified, just bachelor's and postgraduate students, to more than 500,000. It's around 530,000. So it was a huge. It's around it was increases of around 75% of this migration. In the center of the discussion here, from a political perspective, is what really wants Mexico? Want to retain that labor high-skill migration, or they want to go to United States and be more prepared in this kind of technologies, so ICT industries, and coming back, or engineers. And it's tremendous scarcity here in engineers in Mexico and the different labor markets. And it's still, but at the same time, it was more offered in master and doctoral degrees. So many people stay here in Mexico because there is no jobs, there is not really a good jobs in the labor market, so many students keep it studying in the master and doctoral degree. But perhaps the most important issue in terms of what you mentioned in this difference in this presentation is 2 or 3 aspects that I think is quite important for the Mexican situation. One is what you mentioned has absorptive capacities. There is no really in Mexico development neither these ecosystems in Mexico. Why? Well, still there is not enough investment in the different region of the main areas of the immigrants. We have a tremendous returning migrant from United States. It was around 1 million of people returning just from 2005 to 2010. A small percentage of them, they were high educated people. Around 1%, 1.5% of these people were master or doctoral degree returning to Mexico in the last 2005 to 2010. But when they arrive in Mexico, they don't have the same offer they can get, the same job offer they have in the United States. This is a problem. This is when we look at just for the high skill migration, but when we see that in the journals of migrants returning to Mexico, we have a tremendous problem because there is not really a policy, public policy or programs oriented to reintegration of this return in Mexico. We have made some kind of interviews in Veracruz, in some region of Veracruz, for example, to 28 returnees from United States in the last part of the 2005 to 2010, we can see even if they get some kind of capacities or a skill in the labor, U.S. labor market, they cannot apply in Mexico, in the different region. See? Even if they have some kind of investment, small money for investment in some kind of workshop or another kind of small business, the ecosystem is not prepared for that kind of job, of that kind of specialties. Even they don't have a job enough to pay that kind of specialties. So that is a really problem, because it seems that Mexico is not in the moment that they can take advantage of that returning migrants to Mexico. Perhaps, once again, as you already mentioned, there are just a few local markets that can take advantage of that returnee. As Monterrey, Guadalajara, that is another, perhaps some region of Mexico State, has Mexico City and the Mexico State, that can offer to these returnees some kind of specialty. But still, that kind of high-skill migrants, it seems that is growing in Mexico, is growing in United States, but it seems that that the Mexican government has to make some different programs, policies, a specific policy. Perhaps the brain drain is an old perspective in this issue, but still there are many politicians, they are trying to discussing from that perspective, the brain drain, because I'm agree that the new perspective of this brain circulation is what we have to discussion, because since the beginning, the Mexican United States migration, it had been a circular migration, and we have to understand from that perspective that people who are still, if they are keeping several years in the United States, they can investment in Mexico, that many people do it in that way, but still our capacities, the ecosystems in Mexico is still not prepared to get advantage of that high-skilled migrant or high-skilled educated people here in Mexico or in the United States, because this is another difference. We can see it in another, not just in the technology industry, but also people doing or have been educated in other areas, has medicine sector, for example, this kind of doctors or nurses migrant to United States, and how they can involve in that labor market, and if they even think the possibility to return to Mexico, and how can they implement that skill they get in United States market, or even more even in the area of arts or design things. There are many people that they can work in both sides, but still the sectors and the different areas of the labor market in Mexico is, in most of them, they are not prepared really to take advantage of this. Okay, just I stop here my general comment, and again, thank you for this very enriching talk with us. Okay, we can open the discussion. ¿Algunas preguntas? ¿Alguna comentarios? ¿Preguntas?
Okay, I have a few observations.
Adelante.
You already addressed the quality of the universities, which of course it's a big issue in those countries. And that, comparing to what we have done in Mexico, we do not equate definitely what we have done. Still, people would say, although they have very good education in India and in some places in China, still it's not the best. When it comes to high tech, it's still the best. It's in the US. And regarding your observation of how the companies have not changed because of entrepreneurs, of returnees, I'm wondering if maybe it's because now the best Chinese, the best Taiwanese, the best Indian students are staying in the US in places like Google, like Microsoft, where they would have the environment to grow. Because still, in China or in India, as far as I know, and again, this is not my field, they don't have Facebook, they don't have Google, they don't have this very sophisticated company. So that's one thing that I think people should consider. And the other thing is, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, it's ICT, people are talking they are more mature now as a sector, it's more mature. So when you have a more mature industry, the growth rates are not as great as when you really come from down from a very low level. I mean, the US people say, oh, it's not growing because it's really in an asymptote. The growth would have to be really, really steep for it to show. Whereas India and China, they were so low that the growth was really great in the people of most people's eyes. So I would like your.
The first question, the people that are coming to the United States are the most competitive in a country with a lot of China and India, where education is absolutely, or Taiwan, where education is absolutely number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of your top 10 priorities. It's 9 of the top 10 in most families. So the people you're looking at are, the very best of a billion people.
Right.
So they're very high quality. They absolutely, and they have very good undergraduate education in math, sciences, like for sure. I mean, some people say it's too much memorization, etc. But when they come in, they are very good. And so the U.S. universities are then creaming off the top of that, which is, you understand, of course. Then, most of them, and the very best one, you're absolutely right, do stay at Google. They stay at Google, they start their own firms. So, there's this population and there's this population, and on top, and each is a grid of selection grid, right? So we get to this small group at the end. Some of them see opportunities back home. Most of them don't and just stay, that's for sure. But some of them see opportunities back home. They want to do something back home. Their friends are there, et cetera, they went to the bachelor's degree together and they know they're good. Some went abroad, some didn't. So that's sort of that population that we're looking at in the United States. Some of them will want to go back, right? They may or may not be the very best, or they may be transnational, the Guarnizo, Michael Smith transnationalism story. They're moving back and forth. Some are not moving at all, except they go back to visit their family. We're talking about people who are doing business back and forth. The question, if those people are there, what would attract them to do business back and forth? And I think that's where Rodolfo is sort of picking up on if you don't have an ecosystem, you don't have the set of skills in the community such that you go back and then you can hire 30 programmers. I mean, in large parts of Mexico, my guess is most parts of Veracruz, to hire 30, 40, 50 really good programmers, global class or near global class. I might not be so easy. I mean, in Veracruz, probably easy in Mexico City, relatively easy in Mexico City and Guadalajara and Monterrey. But I mean, having those kinds of people in the environment, or having workers that you can put to work in even a factory making ICT things at relatively low wages that are extremely good workers. I mean, there are parts of Mexico, but there are probably other parts where if say, oh, I'm going to build a factory to build PCs. I wouldn't do it there. Maybe I had the workers, but I don't have the transportation network. Or maybe the government, bureaucrats are corrupt and will stop you from doing that or make the business more expensive than it should be, right? In China and in Taiwan and India, so in India, they created the software and technology parks of India, which were outside the corruption system completely. It was a deliberate process. They could actually go to the import customs and say, these products you must release in 2 days. And you can't do mordida on this. They're coming. This land here is ours. The government has nothing to do with it. And you're a multinational and you want to come here. Right? This is a free trade zone, but with no corruption. Right? So they did all of these kinds of things. They actually tried to move it out of the corrupt Indian system. So you have to have those kinds of ecosystem, et cetera, in India, which is extremely corrupt, makes Mexico look very honest. Extreme honesty, right? India takes Mexican corruption and puts you completely to shame in the amount of corruption they have. They moved it. They knew they had to move the damn thing completely outside the government or it couldn't work because the corruption would kill it. Okay, so that's sort of one kind of a set of answers to the first question. Let's see. The second question was, your second
About the maturity of the industry.
The maturity of the ICT industry. People have said that, but there seems to be level after level. Now it's the Facebook, social media. It may or may not be true. It may be fake. We discussed that last time.
Yes.
In China, they closed the Chinese market. So you have Baidu. All these firms I'm looking at here were because China closed the market and they have a huge consumer base, right? So they could create these firms. But even down at the bottom of the ICT industry, the Foxconn level of putting things together, right? Now Foxconn is moving towards a robotized assembly. Now they're going to have to buy robots from someone. They might buy them from Japan, but the Chinese might start making the robots that will replace the workers, right? So people are talking about additive manufacturing, right? 3D printing of kidneys, 3D printing of this if you need that, right? This is ICT. It's materials science, but it's really information communications technologies once again. So is it mature? Maybe. But if it is, then where would you look? In a knowledge-based economy where digitization so far seemingly continues to spin off new opportunities. And there are opportunities at the bottom that you can move up to the higher level, as Taiwan has clearly done, as China is doing today. Though China's still not cutting edge. Nobody would say Chinese software ICT is the same level as US ICT. I was talking again with the founder of Sohu. He's a billionaire, actually, and from the company that he built. And I was asking him, well, why don't you do sort of the highest tech like the US? And he said, in China, we can't do that. We don't have the universities. We don't have all of that. We just need to keep innovating 6 months out, where the United States, with the Stanfords, the Berkeleys, and the MIT, is innovating 10 years out, looking at 10 years from now. But the Chinese understand where they are. They hope to get to where the American universities and the Googles are, but they recognize that they're not there yet, and that's not where they need to compete. So nobody knows the future. Is ICT done? Perhaps, but I think I can give you examples in cloud computing, et cetera, where that's not true. And for Mexico, it doesn't matter. Because you're not going to enter at the Stanford or Berkeley level of electrical engineering, computer science. You can't enter there. You don't have the capacity. you're going to be entering somewhere else. And then if you have entrepreneurs and you get that ecosystem going, you'll find new paths upward. But the great leaps forward, probably not. The Chinese tried that and it didn't work. So yeah.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
I'm sorry if my question seems really ignorant or anything because it's not something. Oh, sorry. So I'm sorry if my question seems really ignorant. This is not something I know about. So within your observations, you said that the Chinese are not returnees. I'm sorry, the returnees are not being important right now. So how do you explain that shift between the 1990s to right now?
So I would explain that shift in the kinds of sectors we're looking at. If you're not embedded in that ecosystem right now, it's moving so fast in China. And we're talking mostly internet space, right? The Facebook of China, the WeChat of China, and all these. It's moving so fast that someone over here at that level finds it very hard to re-enter that particular ecosystem in that particular space. We're mostly looking at the internet space because it's moving so incredibly rapidly. So, and China is kind of a closed system. So I think in the Chinese case, that's probably what's going on. So the returnees were very important in that particular moment. When the internet's starting, they could see it in the United States. And in China, they couldn't see it, right? This is 98, 99, right? And so they were able to see something here and take it back there. Now what's happening in the internet and software space is that the Chinese are absolutely looking at what's going on in Silicon Valley. They don't even need to be here. They start it right away. They start 20 of them. So in that particular space, I think returnees probably are not that important. Where you might find them important would be in the much higher tech, because most of this internet stuff is not the same kind of technology as right, the really deep tech. Cloud computing. Cloud computing is sophisticated algorithm writing to manage, I think it's now exabytes of data. Exabyte is like 12, 15 zeros of data out, right? I mean, that big stuff that Google manages. That's where the technology is today. So that would be kind of my explanation of what happened. And it kind of goes a little bit, unfortunately, against my hypothesis, which is that, that you need to build the ecosystem so the high-tech people can come back. A guy named Mike Wright has done some studies in Beijing, and he took matched pairs of returnee firms, software, tech firms, and non-returnee firms. And he found that there's more patenting on the returnee firms than the non-returnee firms. Unfortunately, those returnee firms don't grow big enough to do an IPO, so we don't pick them up. So it's a complicated space, but that would be it's kind of not a really great explanation. I think we need much more research on this whole area to understand this really complicated space and how it worked out. So the data I gave you was censored data, right? Only successful firms.
Right.
That's still around, we could find them. So it could be the returnees came back. I mean, it's a hypothesis. Returnees came back and created a bunch of firms that failed, and the non-returnee firms succeeded. I mean, we don't know, because I have a data problem. I have a censoring problem. And it's hard to get data back into the 70s in places like Taiwan. Really, I should probably mobilize some Taiwanese professors to look at that, because for me, it's very hard to get that data. It's hard to get the data even back into India, which is an English language, back to the big firms that I had here that were sort of the success stories. So I have a censoring problem in the research policy article that I have. In the other, I have a censoring problem, But I think it's not a problem, which is all the US IPOs, because that's where you would expect returnees. So, but, data population censoring problems are really big in all of this methodology problems.
Okay. Jorge?
Two questions. One is very general, but I follow some of the transnationalism literature, and we have some friends working on that. Could you elaborate more why is not useful to use this concept for understand the returnees? And the other is because it's not an ICT phenomena, it's a more wide phenomena, as you mentioned, and it's global, etc. I'm more comfortable with the transborderism concept. So just want your reaction on that. And the second question is related with the Mexican territory of Mexican space. It's clear that this approach has not been taken or not studied at all in Mexico, or as far as that I know. And Rodolfo is suggesting that there is not exist. I don't know. I'm not quite sure, because it's as I mentioned, it's a global phenomena, and you can apply in many different sectors and activities. So my broad question for the audience and for you is why is not has been not studied in Mexico? Is because there is no the theory or the perspective has not been arrived in Mexico? Is because people are not interested in order to follow that perspective and to make research? I mean, it's not so clear for me why it's not, because I can use the concept for understand many other phenomena, even the prison returnees, which we have on a daily basis. So all capabilities taken on the prisons are taken back. So I mean, it's interesting, the concept, because you can use it in many for many activities.
So the transnationalism argument. So most of the transnationalism arguments that are in my department are transnationalism from below. There's even that term is used. And when I look at most of the transnationalism research, it is not exactly from below, but it's maybe garments and textiles, there's some of that, the Dominican Republic, etc. I read that literature, but I'm sort of more of a Schumpeterian. I'm looking at propulsive sectors, right? And the ICT has been a propulsive sector. You look at the countries that have done the best over the last 35 years in economic growth, and China does everything, right? I know that. But it's countries that have invested or had success in the ICT space. I mean, I think that's particularly Danny Roderick's argument, done quantitative, Hausman, Roderick, and those people. So that's sort of why I've sort of focused there. Okay, because I've always believed that Gary Gariffi and I had arguments about this 25 years ago. Why are you looking at textiles and garments? It's irrelevant for economic development. It's making electronic things and moving up that ladder. There's very little way up the ladder from garments and textiles. So I've sort of looked at that. I have nothing against the transnational. I think it's an interesting argument. But I was interested in these particular sectors. Is transnationalism the explanatory variable? Or is it these are of course dialectically linked, but or is it the indigenous activities at the beginning that make transnationalism something more than a guy who's working as a farm worker in Fresno, saves enough money, and starts a little tienda shop in some village in central Mexico. I'm nothing against that. It isn't going to change anything. Right? I mean, at a large enough scale, perhaps it would. Or builds a big house in some rural Mexico, builds a gigantic house, and hires a whole bunch of servants. Right? Transfer, a money transfer. Right? Now there's a big house somewhere in some village in central Mexico. Does it have any impact on Mexico? Well, a little bit, right? People talking about all these transfer payments, sending money. Everybody from every Mexican working in the United States should send some money to some granny in Mexico, and that's going to create development. Yeah, at some level, those transfer payments do something. But at the end of the day, Mexico is just that little house. As soon as the money transfers stop, I mean, that big house, that big mansion, as soon as the money transfers stop, what happens to the big mansion? It deteriorates back into dust. There's no value created there. So that is why I've looked at these more propulsive sectors. You could look at other sectors, the mechanical sectors, manufacturing sectors, but I think at the end of the day, it's how do you create value in that environment, not just live on transfer payments. So most of that transnationalism literature is a little bit more than transfer payments. But it's not about creating propulsive sectors. It's not about creating ecosystems where things actively happen. I mean, I'm generalizing because I'm not deeply embedded in that literature. But what I read is more this kind of thing. I'm going back and forth. I start a little tienda somewhere in some little place in Mexico or in DR or somewhere. I don't think it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting intellectually. I don't think it's interesting from a development and a policy perspective. So that's sort of my answer about why a lot of that transnationalism work doesn't really strike me as that interesting. Then you asked, sorry, about Mexico was...
Yes, the reason why is not, it's more...
So Mexican policy that I see as a very distant observer, mostly people like Jorge and Oscar tell me what's going on here, because I'm not a student of Mexico, right? So
you're not well informed.
I'm reflecting sort of my thinking about what they tell me, is that the Mexican government has had a lot of eggs to fry. The Mexican government is in Mexico City. It comes from a different perspective than the Asian states. And it's been able to live fairly well on oil, on energy, on whatever they can extract from the Mexican people. And so they don't really have to worry too much about the rest of it. It's a very stable economy. You have, Monterrey and Carlos Slim, and they are very close together with the people on top, and it works well for them. And they never had the development state ideology. It particularly was true in Taiwan and particularly in China, which sees itself as a rising global power and has seen that for a very long time. And also the case of India, and particularly in India, it was the states were very important. Bangalore's Karnataka state, and Karnataka really jumped on board of this and saw it as a way to use a set of assets, relatively educated assets, Chennai in the same way, Delhi also. So the states were more competitive there in trying to develop this, so state policy was also quite important. And then India went through a set of economic crises where they basically ran out of foreign exchange and said, we've got to open up sectors. And the software sector was opened up in many respects because it was not part of the old steel automobiles, which were government controlled. And so entrepreneurs could flow into that and be relatively separated from the state. So I think each of the Asian cases is different, but I think Mexico had a different philosophy and a different configuration of power than either India or China. The power in Mexico seems to be in Mexico City. In China, as Danny Bresnitz argues, yes, Beijing was very important, but the states were also very important and very development-oriented. And that's true in India, too. But again, I don't know enough about Mexico to talk about your states.
Oscar.
Just two brief comments, Martin. The first one is that I found very interesting this argument that you, especially in this, the last article you sent last midnight.
Midnight article.
It is very interesting, and especially because it goes against most of the assumptions, both in the literature and in the policy reflections on this topic. So I think it will be very useful in the discussion, but also in policy making. Just last week, I was in a meeting reviewing some of the Mexican state plans for innovation. And I reviewed the proposals from the state of Oaxaca and Guerrero and Chiapas, but especially the case of Oaxaca. These are three of the most, the less developed states in Mexico, most poverty and so on. And in the case of Oaxaca, they are specifically looking to attract high-skilled Mexicans studying and working in the U.S. as a means to improve innovation capabilities in the state. So, well, actually, I have a question. What would you say to that politicians in Oaxaca looking at this evidence? So your statement would be just don't do that. They will not help you.
Yeah.
Just improve your regional innovation system. That which leads me to the next comment or question. I don't know. It's a comment, I guess. Our last research. I haven't published yet anything, but I'm working on it. We found it's a study of 100 small companies, knowledge-intensive small companies in Mexico, and it seems to be very consistent with this part of your argument because I found two clear patterns for the creation of these companies. One of those is through the influence of MNCs. Both spin-offs or the social professional networks, but they are created using the previous experience on multinationals. Actually, I found one returnee in about 55 companies, one returnee, but very low. I mean, he never worked as a CEO or something similar in the U.S. But it was in manufacturing. And the second pattern is regarding small companies created through the regional innovation systems in different parts of Mexico. And these are ICT companies. So you find manufacturing and logistics companies created through multinationals, and ICT companies created through regional innovation systems. I mean, the web of institutions, and almost all of them using public funds. So it seems to be the hand of the state, and using one of the most successful programs in Mexico, I mean, public programs for creating companies, which is ProSoft, the software development program. It seems to be I mean, you can interpret this as the result of this specific public policy, And so you find ICT companies created through regional innovation system versus manufacturing and logistic companies created through multinationals. Seems to me, and in ICT, I found none returnees as the founders of these companies, but local entrepreneurs trained in public universities, and some of them with previous experiences in Mexico and other companies. No any returnee.
So the first question is, Chile has a returnee program. They give $10,000 or $50,000 to a returnee, and then they hope that they'll build something. So far, I think most of these brain circulation driven, so the brain circulation is sort of this idea up here, driven policies have not accomplished much. Were I to advise them, the first thing I would say is, are there problems that the state itself is creating that's, discouraging entrepreneurship? I mean, too difficult to get a business license, bribes to get a business license, to get telecommunications, if that's an issue. Is telecommunications too expensive out of this area if you want to serve the global market? These are the kinds of issues you might ask. So what is it that the state, and here I know there's the national state and the state, what is it that they can do also to get out of the way? If that's a problem, you don't know. But if corruption's always a problem. It's a cost, it's a tax on success. Well, if that's a problem, can you move it outside the corruption system, right? Which the Indians did. I think the Chinese, not as much, but the Indians did that. The Taiwanese had relatively low levels of little corruption, right? Little corruption, someone biting you every time you want to do something, you get a tax, right? I want to get this license. Okay, it costs $100, but I need $100. These are all costs. They slow things down. The friction that doesn't create value, right? I mean, there's friction that creates, sometimes you need it, right? You don't want someone pouring poison into the river. You need the government to stop that. But I mean, there's these other frictions that are just taxes. Right? Nobody wants to deal with those, right? And if you're in the United States, I'm not saying the United States at the low level is not a lot of corruption. In Washington, it's completely corrupt, but it doesn't affect the small business person down at the bottom. It's not paying a mordida, a little bite on everything you do, right? That slows things down, right? So we don't have that in the United States. We have more corruption than you have in Mexico and Washington, more than you ever dream of, right? I mean, there's so much money to be stolen. But at the lower levels, and that's where the entrepreneur works. They work at the local government and the regional government, not at the national government. So I think that those are the kinds of things I would be thinking about were I a state that wanted to improve my regional innovation system. And, the universities. Can you improve the engineering education in the state university? Because that's where these people are coming from. That's where you're educating them. Can you make your state university the best in engineering? Are there ways to do that, or science, or whatever? I mean, it seems to me those are the kinds of things state governments, certainly in China and India, thought about. Now, again, I don't know Mexico well enough, but those are the policies. Not try to get returnees, give them $10,000 or $30,000 to open up. I think you're just throwing your $30,000 down a rat hole. That would be it's a sort of a blunt advice. But I think it's really about fixing what you can fix at the local and regional level. And you can fix things there. I think. I don't know, maybe not.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Well, what you mentioned right now is the education system is a sector, is a key in Mexico. And still we are far away to get a very good education system in Mexico. And I agree with you, it's tremendous our needs in terms of the engineers. Still, in many universities, we don't have the capabilities to offer more and produce more engineers in Mexico. And it's part of these investments needs in the different sectors. And it seems that these kind of very particularly high educated people needs to be grow up since the, I don't know, the high schools, medium levels to get to reach it. And in the every state in Mexico, it seems very far away to get that level. I'm not saying is not Mexico in that way. Okay, it seems with the new kind of education reforms or some kind of investment in different regions, it seems Mexico go in that way, but still we are far away to reach some kind of levels to get. We are receiving in the last years many people from the United States who was employed in several occupations that they can absorb from that market, but when they back to Mexico, it seems there is no salaries, there is not equipment, there is not a good ecosystem to apply all these acknowledged they get in that markets. I don't say that everything or all the sectors in Mexico. I think there are several levels, but still we need to improve with more investment, less corruption, and many others.
Except for politicians, no?
Right?
In my
Sí.
former life, I was a management professor in Mexico City. And I recall a story of one of my former students. She was an MBA student. She had a small internet company before entering a full-time MBA. And she enrolled in our MBA program because her company broke. And she said that the issue was that at peak hours, the line would go down. So, of course, we have a monopoly of telecommunications here at Telmex. So at peak hours, the service would go down. So eventually, all of her clients just went with Mr. Slim. So those kinds of things. And at the time, I mean, I'm sure that everybody has heard it here, at least those two in front of me. There were rumors about patent problems where people would say, I don't like patenting something because they're going to steal my invention if I patent it here in Mexico. I don't know if they were true, but those were the rumors.
I don't know if you want to say something?
Well, I agree with her on the telecom, which is, you can't have an ICT industry without telecom. And cheaper, better telecom is absolutely critical. India deregulated and created competition. Actually, my friend Rafiq Dosani was part of this. Actually created competition to bring prices of telecom down and to get quality up. And Mexico is on telecom. We were talking about this in the car on the way over here. Mexico's telecom situation is
Horrible.
it's criminal. It's criminal. It's criminal because it's holding the country back from being part of the world's network. I mean, it's not that bad, but compared to any other major developing country, Mexico is just completely a joke. It's a joke, really, compared to any other. I mean, compared to Pakistan, right? I mean, if you're not doing as well as Pakistan, that's not a strong statement of how well you're doing, and that is a self-inflicted wound. It's a self-inflicted wound. You're shooting yourself in the foot, and nobody cares. You want to shoot yourself in the foot? Fine, right? You can do it as long as you want. So telecom is absolutely, you're absolutely, completely, 100% right. It's a disaster in the ICT world. It's the worst. You can have not running water, like India. You can have electricity that goes on and off, but you can't lose telecom. Because that's the way you connect in a knowledge economy.
Oh, we have a new reform.
There we go.
Hopefully.
Yeah, that's the one you should organize. One to beat Telmex over the head.
Oh, gosh. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rodolfo.
Welcome.